We're essentially a defense electronics company, on a mission to accelerate indigenous technology development and adoption for the Indian armed forces. Skills become very, very transferable if there is a high degree of, agility, high degree of learnability that you kind of provide as a culture and with the kind of leadership that you bring along. There are certain areas where we are fairly import dependent even today. I think everyone talks about the Rafales and how, aircrafts we are still having to import.
This is, of course, historically was a space that, most young entrepreneurs shied away from, given everything that in general we would hear that, about defense procurement and things like that, right? From what you're describing, at least it seems like there's a sea change that has happened.
So when we acquire, we don't look at it as a acquirer-acquiree relationship. We don't look at it as us becoming their bosses. How could I ever become a boss to somebody who's spent 40 years building out the ecosystem?
What would be your advice to someone who's sort of thinking of starting up in defense? Hello, everyone. Welcome to Manufacturing Mindset. I'm Sarvesh Kanodia, and I'm glad to have on the show Rohan Gala, who's the co-founder and CEO of Sanlayan.
Hey, hi, Sarvesh. How are you doing? Thanks a lot for
I'm
having me on the show.
welcome, Rohan. The pleasure is all ours. Let's kick it off by talking about Sanlayan's growth strategy. You've, of course, taken a very unique approach. So tell us about the approach that you've taken to build out the company.
Right. So before I get into the growth strategy, Sarvesh, would just like to uh, talk about, what we really do for some of the people who may not know us because we're a relatively young company. We're essentially a defense electronics company, on a mission to accelerate indigenous technology development and adoption for the Indian armed forces. Uh, the name also kind of has linkages to how we've approached our GTM. Sanlayan is actually Sanskrit for fusion, and I think it's to do with the unique perspectives and experiences that all three of us founders have with respect to our complementary backgrounds. It's with respect to the approach we took with respect to building the business. While being a startup, we have gone and acquired companies as our go-to-market strategy, and also with respect to the problem statements or the insights that we derive when speaking to the end users. Um, One of the big insights for us was that there is a huge requirement for indigenous technology development, but on the other hand, there are hundreds of MSMEs in India who are already present and doing some parts of the value chain. But what we realized is that there was a clear uh, gap when it came to large scale players. And so the intent for us to acquire really was to say that how do we take what's there already and build on that to kind of achieve success in a more shortened time period or an accelerated time period, because we didn't want to go through the typical startup approach of building products, which might be a niche technology and new age technology. Because in defense, what really matters is, time tested, battle proven platforms. And that really comes with the vintage of having people who understand, of having relationships with the end users, of understanding the end user problems. So that was really one of the reasons where we said, let's look at acquiring capabilities through acquisition. Uh, Secondly, let's look at acquiring capabilities through strategic partnerships, whether they're domestic or foreign partnerships. And the third one was saying that where both of these approaches don't work and there is, significant headroom for that space to grow, let's also look at doing in-house R&D, doing suo moto development to kind of create that technology. So really the approach is all about creating and acquiring capabilities. And we're kind of agnostic whether those capabilities are built in-house or they come from outside. The idea is that we should be able to deploy it at scale, for the need of the nation today.
Interesting. So you're saying rather than just building out something from scratch, which of course can take a lot of time, and a lot of the needs that we have, any which ways are immediate, and there are players who are already doing it. Why not work with them in different capacities and actually augment whatever they have and build on top of that?
Absolutely.
Super. And just staying on this, could you give us a sense of what are the kind of products or, to some extent, the capabilities that you are building as an organization for people to know what the company is all about, within the broader defense space?
So like I said, Sarvesh, we're essentially in the defense electronics space. Uh, Just to give you a sense, of the capital outlay, electronics would typically contribute anywhere between 30 to 45% of the entire outlay. The other large parts being, the mechanical structures and the composites that kind of make up the entire platform. So that's the space we are in, the broader space. And within electronics, if you were to look at some of the areas that we are already fairly deep in, is on the pure digital electronics or avionics, as we call it, everything that goes into aircrafts. We're strong in naval electronics, so a lot of things that go on to submarines, ships, destroyers. Power electronics is another area that we have recently forayed into through an acquisition. And the last one, which we are building in-house, is actually on the radars and electronic warfare side of things, which we feel is how modern warfare is going to be conducted, where most of the new technology and innovations are actually happening. So these are the large areas that we are part of and building out in parallel for all of them right now.
Super, very exciting. And of course, there's a lot to, drill deeper into in all the things you mentioned. But before we do that, I actually wanted to, talk about your personal journey as well, right? You've, of course, worked across industries in your career, right? From consumer goods to real estate, logistics, food delivery, and of course, defense. What are some of the key traits that you think made you successful in sort of switching careers, in having a diverse experience across these fields? And the reason I ask is because a lot of our audience are, of course, people who are entrepreneurs and are looking for ideas on what they could do and learn from your experience. But a lot of those are also who are budding entrepreneurs. And what can they learn from the diverse experience that you've had?
Yeah, right. So I think very early on in my career, I got access to a great finishing school in consumer goods at ITC, and being part of the consumer insights team kind of led my developmental or foundational journey in being very close to the customer, being very close to the end user, understanding those problem statements and being very customer focused. I would say that's one of the important things that has held me in good stead, across all the different assignments that I've done across industries. And the unique thing about this is, the applicability of being customer centric actually cuts across B2B, B2C, B2G, no matter where you are, becomes very, very important when you're solving from the customer's lens. Just to give you an example, right now we could create a lot of, great technological products, but if they don't work in the field, right, it kind of defeats the purpose. And so that becomes an important yardstick to measure, ourselves and our efforts against. Another important thing I would say would definitely be, building great teams, working with great people. Uh, no matter, you know, the core expertise of people. I feel like, at least for people from the management background and side of things, skills become very, very transferable if there is a high degree of agility, a high degree of learnability that you kind of provide as a culture and with the kind of leadership that you bring along. And so that's something that again transcends the industry, transcends the kind of problem statements that you're solving. So I would say these are some of the important things that we kind of use to kind of do first principles problem solving, and something that I rely upon as a personal framework, no matter what the industry really is.
let's now, sort of shift gears and talk about, manufacturing, which is what the whole sort of podcast is all about as well, right? And there's a whole call in India today to indigenize, defense manufacturing, and of course that's your sort of focus area as well. And we've seen a lot of growth in India over the last few years where that is happening, right? Give us a sense about where do you think indigenization has or is already happening and we're sort of doing it successfully, and where are those big places where we are still sort of dependent on imports, and hopefully in the near to medium future we will sort of also get there.
Right. So I think uh, I'll break it down into two parts, right? So I'll just try to explain the value chain of products to kind of give a sense. So at the highest level of, integrated products, we have something that is called platforms, right? So every aircraft, ship, air defense system would be a platform. Now, these would be consisting of multiple different systems. Now, if we just keep on taking the example of an aircraft, it would have multiple systems. Like the engine is a system of systems by itself, right? The cockpit and the avionics suite would be another large set of systems of systems. The fire control radar and the electronic warfare suite is another large, system of systems which has multiple sensors. And so what we have been able to do very uniquely in India is do a lot of systems, do a lot of subsystems that have been able to be indigenized over the last 20, 30 years. And of course, there's been a rapid acceleration of that since the last 5 or 6 years, since the reforms actually came in, including, defense acquisition procedure, etc. Um, and so what we have been able to do very successfully at a country scale is get, all the large missile programs off the ground, and some of them were used recently during Operation Sindoor. We have, the Agni, the Astra, the BrahMos ecosystem, which has actually, uh, you know, reached kind of global excellence and being spoken about across the world today. We have been able to indigenize large aircraft carriers like the INS Vikrant, which has been completely indigenously designed and manufactured. Uh, but then there are certain areas where we are fairly import dependent even today. You know, I think everyone talks about the Rafales and how, aircrafts we are still having to import. We are talking about a fifth generation program where we're trying to have our AMCA, but also looking at, let's say, a Sukhoi 57, or, talking to the US as a stopgap arrangement. That's somewhere the country hasn't made significant progress. Another key area is on the engine side of things. Again, 404, is another, program that has been spoken about, and something where we haven't reached the kind of outcomes that the country would require to have, complete self-reliance. Another couple of things would be large, drones or UAVs like the MQ-9B, which we recently bought from the US, forces. Um, the air defense system, which was spoken about a lot in Operation Sindoor, while we have our indigenously done air defense systems, but the S-400, which is kind of like the global benchmark in terms of air defense, is also something that we haven't kind of indigenized. So I think it's a good mix where there is a clear movement towards indigenization. Fifth generation platform, government is talking about a public-private partnership to kind of accelerate. We have been able to obviously get the landmark Sukhoi and Sukhoi Make in India, which is kind of a TOT, and so kudos on that. There is the LCA Tejas, which obviously is a huge program, and we have been able to indigenize very, very large parts of it. Um, and so that's kind of where the balance really lies. Uh, from a Sanlayan point of view, where we are going after is a lot of the subsystems that kind of go onto these platforms, where we are trying to one, indigenize a lot of the existing Russian systems, a lot of the existing French systems, Israeli systems, and then on the radars and electronic warfare side, since data is kind of a critical part of that, we're looking at completely remodeling the supply chain and seeing how we can have strategic self-reliance from the operating system point of view, where the data resides, to actually going all the way back to the components and the supply chain that kind of become very, very strategic with respect to the semiconductors. So that's kind of like the playing field in which we are operating.
Very interesting. And one follow-up question on this one. You mentioned about the different aircraft, drones, etc., right? Let's say, given that we've been successful in building a Vikrant, what is the barrier when it comes to, let's say, you're building an aircraft or a, highly specialized drone? What are some of the key components that you think are the biggest barriers that we need to manufacture in-house for us to be able to build those important, sort of, you say aircraft or drones or, any of those outcomes?
Yeah, I think it wouldn't be a single thing that kind of is, the problem. It's just that historically the sector was, structured in a very, very different way, and we were a very large importer of these large systems, and so that ecosystem took a while to kind of get built. Let's say when I'm talking about the Air Force, but if you look at the Navy, we had the shipyards, the Goa shipyard, Mazgaon dock, Cochin shipyard, and so we got that. Core technology of shipbuilding in-house, and which is why we were able to realize, let's say, something like a Vikrant, which we've been able to do for a Tejas, which is a tactical fighter, but we haven't been able to do for, let's say, a frontline uh, equivalent of, let's say, a Rafale or a Sukhoi till now. So that's one very large macro structural issue. But if you were to talk about specifics, like I said, one of the largest pieces missing is on the engine and propulsion side of things, where we don't have a real program, for the engine side of things, and that kind of becomes a very big blocker to developing our own aircraft. There was the Kaveri engine program that the DRDO has been, kind of developing over a while, but it looks like even with the cost considerations and the fact that it's kind of something that we wanted to build on our on our own soil versus importing. So that becomes a big one. I think also the fact that because of that structure, what happened is that earlier private companies were essentially relegated to, components and subsystems. And so what happened is like the entire large value chain, which is like the platforms and the large systems of systems and systems, kind of were concentrated with the DPSUs. And the DPSUs being large organizations and organisms have their own velocity, have their own kind of working rhythm. And so what has happened in the last few years is that global macros have made it very, very imperative that that acceleration happens. And so now you see a lot of push for private companies to kind of chime in, participate, and you see that ecosystem getting built out today. So I think it's some of these things which were, macro conditions, and also the fact how Indian industry was structured earlier. But I think a lot of that is now changing with the government, being very, very clear about how the policy needs to be, being very clear about the fact that we need to de-risk from global value chains, especially true for not just India, but globally, where all the countries are looking at being inward driven rather than outward driven.
Yes. No, I think a very good point around the building of the ecosystem. And of course, we've seen a lot of recent initiatives over the last few years around iDEX, a lot of procurement being done, via startups and smaller companies which are building interesting products, or even PLIs, etc., and broadly in
Yeah.
manufacturing and not just in defense. So what's been your experience as you've tried to leverage some of these sort of initiatives? And what do you think are still some of these gaps as, when we talk about building that ecosystem, apart
Yeah.
from some of these existing initiatives, what are one or two suggestions that you'll probably have that, okay, if we could have this, it'll probably help us even more as a young defense company?
Yeah. So I think on the initiative side, like I said, right, it all started with the acquisition procedure and the entire reform around the fact that private participation is now welcome. There is a negative import list for items up to a certain value which cannot be imported. There is a positive indigenization list across all the three forces, which says that those specific items need to be indigenized over a certain period of time with very hard deadlines, which is allowing more and more players to kind of attack those problem statements, right? Within the DAP, then you have a lot of different programs. I'll talk about the large ones, which is, DCPP, Development Come Production Partners, which allows companies to develop and then be the mass production partners. There is a Make One, Make Two. There is something which is called, IDDM, which is, indigenously designed and developed and manufactured, which again ensures that smaller companies don't kind of get, run over by OEMs who do, predatory pricing, etc. So some of these are kind of attacking the large problem statements that, we are looking at across the three forces right now. With respect to startups, of course, there's a, defense MSME startup policy. There is the iDEX, there is the TDF, which is the Technology Development Fund, which are all focused towards ensuring that there is enough support from the government with respect to financial support, with respect to problem statement support coming directly from end users, where either individual innovators or smaller companies can actually attack those problem statements, and while doing that, they don't take carry significant financial risk of going running over budgets, etc. But having said that, the approach that we took with Sanlayan, and to the point that I made earlier with respect to our fusion and addressing problem statements today, we are actually going more towards suo moto development of products, capabilities, and technologies through our own capital, and that's one of the reasons that we actually raised, external capital from some of the largest, global and domestic venture capital firms, is to actually be ahead of the curve, be in sync with the requirements of the users today, and build out technologies that would actually, work not just from an India perspective, but hopefully also be leveraged from a global exports point of view. So that's really where we are focusing right now. But of course, there are multiple TCPP, IDDM, and MAKE programs where either us or our subsidiaries have been part of over the last few decades. And so we kind of, keep getting that access to government, support and policy support.
Interesting. So just the procurement policy and the way it's being framed and executed, that by itself is helping sort of build the ecosystem, give impetus to younger companies. And you mentioned, of course, raising external capital, private company. You spoke about, the central PSUs, etc. as well. This is, of course, historically was a space that, most young entrepreneurs shied away from, given everything that in general we would hear that, about defense procurement and things like that, right? From what you're describing, at least it seems like there's a sea change that has happened, which is also inviting young and smart entrepreneurs like you to come and play in this space and, devote a substantial part of your career, rather than, being sort of bogged down by heavy bureaucracy and sort of all different kinds of bad practices that earlier would happen on the procurement side.
Yeah, I think, like I said, right, and there's a clear mandate from the government, and it's become very clear over the last 5, 6 years, right? Globally, macro tailwinds have also kind of pointed in the same direction. I think a lot of acceleration happened because of the wars, of course, Russia, Ukraine, now Israel, Iran. So you're seeing post the Second World War lull, uh, of kind of like a relative demilitarization era, you're now seeing again both local and global conflicts come into the mainframe, and I don't see that going away, especially with respect to the Indian subcontinent. Again, we have multiple adversaries and multiple borders, that are under threat. So I think these macros have helped create that environment, helped bring that understanding for people who were earlier looking at software and AI jobs as the real thing or building out marketplaces. There is a clear need now for reindustrialization, remilitarization. What also happened in the last 10 years with the consumer electronics, template that the government was able to create and actually see real success, India becoming one of the largest exporters of iPhones. These are all signals that made it clear, I think, to entrepreneurs, to technocrats, that there was real action behind, policy, and that some of the things that were very, very risk on were probably now moving towards risk off kind of things where large outcomes can be created to the tune of what happened, let's say, in the US economies, the European economies, the Chinese economy over the last few years. And so that's that general shift that is happening. I think it's underway, but there is still a long way, for us to go. Um, a lot of the initiatives with respect to digitalization and general transparency that has come around with respect to procurement also gives a lot of confidence to smaller companies to kind of put their risk capital, put their time, resources, and actually go, let's say, heads up against larger companies if their product actually shines through. So I think
Yeah,
these are some of the big things that have really helped out.
and I think one of the things you mentioned, which is very important, is the leveraging private capital as well, which you've been able to raise. And of course, we'll need a lot more private capital also coming in beyond what the government spending is on the procurement side, right, for the companies to grow. This is one of those spaces where, of course, as a manufacturing focused fund, we've been looking at defense, but and I've spoken to other private equity investors in the past, and I've seen a mixed sort of view, right? There are some who will say because contracts could be lumpy or, other issues that they would want to stay away. Whereas there are some who are, of course, actively sort of investing, right? Both on the VC side as well as on the P side. Tell us about your experiences. You've gone through the fundraise. What was the general feedback? What worked or what did not work? More from a sector point of view as you were pitching to investors and what their feedback is on the sector right now.
Right. So, Sarvesh, what we realized when we started, and even before that in our last assignment, is that there's now definite investor interest across stages for, manufacturing businesses, which were typically not so sexy during like the building era of, e-commerce 1.0 in the country. We've had large manufacturing marketplaces, kind of create multi-billion dollar outcomes. Some of them have IPO'd, some of them are on their way. We are seeing a level of decoupling of marketplaces and them becoming verticalized, full stack players also over the last few years. So there's definitely a lot of investor interest. What happened very uniquely in defense is that public market investors actually were the ones to look at the opportunity and see the re-rating of all the large DPSUs, some of the listed firms who are 30, 40 years old, they saw the re-rating because of the global conflicts. And that's how I think a lot of that rub-off happened also onto the private markets. And so while it was involved process to help people understand value chains, to understand, how procurement works, to understand what challenges are there. There is a clear understanding and now articulation of the need for private capital to significantly back, good founders, good companies, because here we're not looking at, 1 to 10 unicorns solving India's defense challenges, right? I think what it needs probably, and my reading is that probably hundreds of sharp focused, companies and founders solving for the niches, solving for the thousands of problem statements that we have as a large defense spender, as a large country with so many different problem statements, as a country who was mostly reliant on imports to actually indigenize, to modernize, um, and to kind of figure out all the different parts of the value chain that need to be uh, I would say, solved in that sense to kind of create a truly resilient and self-reliant, Indian defense ecosystem. So that is clearly there. Of course, some of the challenges you spoke about are, I would say, features of the industry and not a bug. You would have large, lumpy contracts. You would have, revenues that kind of don't grow very linearly month on month or quarter on quarter. And so it would require, you know, a capital that kind of has that appetite, right? And so what we've seen is that now there are a bunch of manufacturing funds, including y'all, a bunch of very defense-focused, deep tech-focused funds who are looking to play that long game, right? Who are not looking, and that also reflects in the kind of founders and companies that are being born, right? I don't think it's a game where you're looking for quick early, scaling wins. You're not looking for that billion multiplier of, being a country of so many people. What you're looking for is, heads down execution, playing a long game, answering a national call, right? With respect to the sovereignty of the country, with respect to creating real deterrence, and with respect to creating real resilience and self-reliance when it comes to such a strategic sector. So I think things are moving. Like I said, it's only the start. This could be, multi-decade opportunity for people to build out. And that's essentially what we are looking to do with respect to the ecosystem play, partnering with existing companies, partnering with startups, partnering with foreign companies to kind of bring in critical technologies and create an ecosystem that actually helps the end user at the end of the day. That because that's really what is most important.
Yeah. And I think one thing which you said makes a lot of sense that this is not a winner takes all market. By the market itself is so large, the niche shares itself are so huge that there will be multiple large companies that will get created here, unlike a typical sort of consumer internet sort of
Yeah.
market, right? And you've, of course, in this market taken a very interesting approach. Like you mentioned, one prong of your strategy is to make acquisitions, right? Uh, Generally, when you think of it, acquisitions have had a mixed sort of outcome. There are, of course, very successful companies like a Motherson, Sumi, etc., who've built, on the back of acquisitions, right? But there are some others who've, of course, struggled to make M&A work, right? What's been your sort of learnings as far in making at least, the ones that you have done or in the process of closing, make it work? What's been the learnings, as you're sort of doing this in the early days?
Yeah, very interesting question. I think the truism is really that 99% of or 90% of acquisitions fail, right? But I think when we started the company and looked at this hybrid approach of capability building, what we were fairly clear is that we don't want to buy revenue, we don't want to buy customers, right? Because given the state of the industry, there is practically one customer, right? If you talk about the Indian MOD as being it, of course, there are DPSUs, there are the armed forces, there are private companies, etc. But essentially, you're serving like one end customer, and so it's not that challenging. But what we also realized is that there is a deep set of values that companies need to understand with respect to operating parameters, with respect to how technology is developed, with respect to how technology needs to be validated, certified for these kind of applications. Just to, bring out a parallel or a, comparison. Uh, Before this, I was, involved in manufacturing televisions and smartwatches, right? Now, if you just look at the, comparison, we used to manufacture, you know, in the lakhs per month with respect to, let's say, a audio device or a smartwatch. And that's kind of like the time cycle, right? You would keep that watch for about, as a consumer, for 12, 18, 24 months, and then, it's kind of fashion, so it moves very quickly. But when you talk about platforms like a ship or an aircraft, you're going to buy that and probably run that for 3 to 4 decades. That would be the commission life. And so when you're talking those kind of time scales, you need to have quality, you need to have, production, manufacturing, um, at a level which can support those kind of things, right? Typical age of startups also is not 30, 40 years. You wouldn't see companies, staying on for those many number of years. So it becomes very, very important to have that staying power. It becomes very important for people to understand what it really takes. And to bridge that gap, we said, let's look at this acquisition. Let's look at how to acquire those softer aspects of the business, of the understanding of what is required to, play in this market and win this market. So that kind of became something that helped us immensely, right? We acquired our first company, which has been around for 25 years. Our second company has been around for 37 years. So you can just imagine the kind of experience, the kind of exposure, the kind of real world situations, experience that comes with the teams that have kind of, delivered products over there. So that became, the format that let's acquire capability, let's acquire real product expertise and not really revenue and customers. And so when you are doing that, right, what happens is a lot of the other reasons for M&A, which typically fail, right, which is killing competition, which is gaining market share, which is, trying to thwart other people, all of those actually go away. And so what you're really building out is a full stack capability play. And so we are very, very diligent about what we want to acquire, why we acquire. There is a clear problem statement with respect to why we would want to look at a certain capability, why a company is good for that capability, and what is the unique value proposition that us as the acquirer brings to that company. Because today, let's say if I were to look at larger companies like an Adani, Tassel, or even larger, smaller companies that are, let's say, already listed, there wouldn't be a lot that we may have to give to them, right? And so that marriage is not of equals per se. So when we realized that the real success was when we were able to add enough accretive value to that company, and that company also brought us a level of value, that was meaningful to us. And so that's really what kind of shaped our early strategy, our early, frameworks around acquisition.
And how do you manage the team aspect for it, right? Because that's the trickiest for people. You mentioned companies 20, 30, 40 years, right? Almost 40 years. Uh, these are very senior people, of course, right? And, as a they're looking at a young founder who's now suddenly become their boss. How does that work out? How do you manage some of the egos or just culture itself, right? Forget about ego, just the culture itself might be very
Yeah,
different. How do
yeah,
you make that integration happen?
yeah. Again, this is something we deliberated a lot. Had some experience at our previous organizations, doing acquisitions in similar B2B old manufacturing businesses kind of spaces. I think few of the learnings were that at the end of the day, uh, most businesses, right, unless it's like edge AI, etc., are people businesses. And so managing people's motivations, managing people's incentives, what drives people, what inspires people actually becomes the bedrock of the relationship, right? And मतलब हिंदी में बोलते हैं ना, मतलब शादी करना इज लाइक द फर्स्ट स्टेप, उसको निभाना इज एक्चुअली व्हाट इज वेरी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. So when we acquire, we don't look at it as a acquirer acquiree relationship. We don't look at it as us becoming their bosses. How could I ever become a boss to somebody who's spent 40 years building out the ecosystem, even before some of our team was earthside or born. The real hack is to say that there's a joint vision and joint ownership of where we want to take the company, what that mission is, being completely married to the mission together, and looking at how complementarily the acquirer or the acquiree can devote energy, devote time and capabilities to that mission. That's really what has worked very well for us, in terms of just being very, very aligned with respect to what the end goal is. And then, of course, in M&As, it becomes very, very important. And I think in sales in general, in business, becomes very important. What is the ownership that you're able to create? Not just, physical ownership, but what is the inherent ownership that people feel about the company? And that can come through multiple ways, right? It can come through completely aligned incentives. It can come through, performance related payouts. It can come through ESOPs. It can come through bonuses that are linked to performance. So I think those are all uh, part of the toolkit that we have deployed till now. But like I said, every capability acquisition or company acquisition has its own, merit case. It has its own use case, and so you need to have a clear solution that is, executed to kind of ensure that there is no friction, or at least there is a low friction environment going into the acquisition.
Interesting. And of course, as you come along, there are certain things that will work, and I'm sure the strategy will also continue evolving, right? But there are enough successful examples for one to look at, right? Which of course, prove that this is something that can work at scale also, right? So makes a lot of sense in terms of the way you're approaching it. Um, I want to talk about one aspect in particular, which is of course very, very on people's minds, is the use of drones in general today in warfare, right? Typically, if you look at it few years back, a decade back, all the impression we had is, people going with tanks and guns and things like that, right? That of course is one form of warfare, but we are seeing a lot of drones being used now across the, different sort of wars, short wars that we've seen in the recent past across the globe. What's your approach, and what's your strategy to figure out how do you play in that drone sort of ecosystem and how that is evolving overall as well for India, apart from what you guys are doing?
Right. So, very interestingly, we were at one of the armed forces headquarters a while back, um, which was mainly dealing with, unmanned systems and counter unmanned systems. And there was a trivia that was, put up on the slides where people were saying that countries like Ukraine, now obviously highest defense spenders in the world in terms of percentage of GDP, but they're fairly small, compared to the overall scale, have drones to the tune of 2 to 3 million drones. And at that point, according to again estimates, India had 15,000 drones, right? And so you see how a real war or a warlike situation, and of course this was before, Op Sindoor, so I'm talking, something like March, but you can see how a war completely changes the battlefield, completely changes the, what you call the, kill chain that used to operate earlier, where you would have a forward deployed army, you would have, the Air Force, you would have the Navy, and now it has moved to this very new battlefield where you're seeing use of unmanned systems, whether they are aerial, ground, submersibles that are now becoming very, very disruptive assets because they're easy to mass manufacture, they're very, very cost effective, and the kind of damage that they can inflict is very significant, as we've all seen from the last, operation that Ukraine carried out deep in the heart of Russia, right? Whereas if you were to look at more uh, old type of battles, you would have standoff range Indian, tanks or fighters or the infantry operating out of the Indian space and exchanging across the LOC. So the battlefield itself is changing very, very drastically. And so the solutions that are required to either propagate this kind of war or to mitigate this kind of war are also evolving very, very rapidly, and this is not just an Indian perspective but a completely global perspective, right? um, a ship would typically take anywhere between 5 to 10 years to build, right? Whereas now, both in the US and China, we are talking about companies building autonomous submersibles or autonomous surface vehicles that can actually go from design on paper to mass manufacturing within 12 months and being able to do 30 of those in parallel, right? So the scale of war is obviously changing. And if we talk about small, cheap drones, those can be in the numbers of thousands, where our total aircraft today in the country is about 2,000. We are talking about now inducting like over 1 million drones in the country. From a Sunline perspective, we are not a platform builder. We don't want to, at least right now, get into that space of building drones. But what we are doing as part of our, business, which is very core to us, is actually building out the payloads that will go on these drones, right? Which actually create lethality, which create ability for these drones to transmit, whether it's images, video links, communication, reconnaissance data, surveillance data. So we are building a lot of the payloads that would go on whether, unmanned submersibles, unmanned aerial vehicles, unmanned ground vehicles. And on the other end of the spectrum, we're also building out solutions that will ensure we are well protected against some of these assets that our adversaries may have. So that's entirely on the counter unmanned systems space, which is layered counter unmanned systems, right from imaging systems, which are like radars and electro-optic systems, to passive detection systems, to soft kill jamming spoofing systems, and then finally even hard kill or kinetic killing systems which kind of neutralize the threat depending on what the threat assessment is. So that's the two areas really that we are doubling down um, on our product roadmap, given what has happened over the last couple of years, both globally and back at home.
Clearly, it seems like there's a sea of opportunities for one what could do, like in all the things that you're describing. Like there's so many parts to the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And it's like even if you pick one small component, it's like large enough for anyone to sort of go deep into that and sort of build capabilities and be a large company. What would be your advice to someone who's sort of thinking of starting up in defense, or existing companies who probably have some capabilities perhaps on the consumer electronic side, thinking of getting on the defense side? What are some of the areas that you think people are still not talking about or tackling, especially from a new age entrepreneur point of view or technology point of view, which we need to indigenize that you suggest we sort of focus on? Of course, apart from the engine that you mentioned, there is that big area, but anything apart from that as well?
Um, Look, so I think if you look at it from a horizontal point of view, uh, the kind of product life cycles that we've seen for legacy platforms uh, just makes it a very long and tedious process, right? Because any aircraft, let's say $100 million north, would have hundreds and hundreds of systems that kind of go in there. And each of those systems is either, compute, is either sensors, is either semiconductors that typically were always imported, that still large part are imported. And so for companies that are looking to build out, I think there are multiple problem statements right from component manufacturing. We have some startups that are solving the semiconductor GaN power electronic side of things. Then we have small subsystems which kind of take these semiconductors and build computers or, small form factor computers, processing units. That's something that we do. Going up from there, there are, systems that can be built out of multiple sensors and multiple computers. And then, of course, some of these autonomous platforms using AI, using data that is being generated all across the world to kind of build autonomous systems that can actually be ensure that we don't lose our manpower, we don't lose critical life and assets. Apart from this, there is an entire value chain that is now being developed, because you have to appreciate that defense is, you know while orders are lumpy, use of defense assets, right, whether that's submarines, aircrafts, is even more lumpy. You will not have war for decades, and then you need to have a short, intense, altercation with, let's say, your adversary, which would last between a few days to weeks to months, and everything that you have done over the last decade actually comes into play, right? And so, one is the ability to mass manufacture at scale becomes very, very important. And so, when companies are designing, they should take that into consideration, that these designs are made for manufacturing, are made for ensuring that mass manufacturing is at least an option when there is a need for it, when crunch time actually arises. Because otherwise, what happens is you will have a lot of buildup of arsenal of armory, and that being used in kind of like a shark tooth wave, where it's complete usage, and then again it would take a lot of time for building up. But what we've seen in the last few wars globally is that these wars are not fast, they're not decisive, they've gone on for like multiple years. And so when you have this kind of engagement, you need to be able to manufacture at scale, you need to be able to manufacture at global quality standards, because you want those things to work first time right. And you need to have that depth of manufacturing to be able to keep manufacturing. And of course, like I spoke about earlier, the entire value chain to ensure that a single component or a set of components doesn't become, reason single point of failure for the entire value chain. So I think these are large areas that still are very, very big opportunity areas for anyone looking at manufacturing for defense in India.
One thing is very clear, it's not for the faint-hearted either. And tell me something, this particular part is also intriguing for me, given your journey. You've moved from being, working as senior executives across organizations to being a founder, which by itself is a very, challenging sort of exercise when you're starting something. And of course, you started in the defense where there are all sorts of, different dynamics that we sort of spoke about today. What do you think has been the most difficult part of that shift? Both probably on from a sector point of view, but just generally, sort of being an executive to now being a founder, and how you navigated some of those difficult steps that came along the way.
Right. I think on the sector one, right, one of the most important ones was realizing, and I've had a history of working in consumer startups, that were very fast, high growth, because of kind of like the 1 billion multiplier effect that a lot of the Indian startup ecosystem has seen. That working in defense, you know, working towards this mission is really a marathon and not a sprint. And so, there while being a startup, there is a clear balancing act that needs to be done where you're trying to move fast in what you're doing, right? And so whenever you're moving fast, there's a lot of noise, right? But the kind of end use that you have, the kind of systems and products that you're building, have very, very low tolerance for noise in the final product. And so having that balance between speed and velocity is something that has been a complete rewiring for um, the entire founding team, Abhijit, Rahul, and I, and also for our leadership. That's something that we deliberate on a lot, right? Um, Something that comes from that at a company level is constantly evaluating risk reward, building out uh, in the face of opportunity, which is disguised as ambiguity. Because when you are trying to move fast, when you're trying to do things that will probably come into play a few years from now, you have a lot of unknowns that you need to kind of, uh, resolve real time. You need to absorb into your solution sets. So being uh, married to the problem, but not being married to the solution is, I think, something that became very important from a sector point of view. From personal lens, I would say, you know, when you're working at a large organization, when you're looking at all the critical functions, right? Talent, capital, risk appetite, execution or operations, you always have, a large kind of organization backing you. You have a large kind of support system to kind of fall back on. But during the early stages of a startup, I would say, this is something where it is a complete lack of organization and complete personal accountability that comes in, right? Every decision that you take kind of, decides what direction the company is moving in. Every micro decision has to be thought about whether it's actually something that could have a repercussion on the larger, direction or velocity of the company. So I think that has been a big, change in terms of saying that you need to be very thought through. We need to be taking personal accountability of our decisions as like the final decision maker, right? There is no real, I mean, yeah, there is a board and, we consult with the board, but essentially you're navigating the aircraft while building it, metaphorically and literally. So those have been, changes that kind of have really defined what I've done personally and what the organization does as under my leadership.
And what is your motivation in doing all of this, all these challenges that you're taking? I'm sure you would have made money choosing a relatively less difficult sector as well.
Yes.
But what's your goal with building Sanlayan and doing and going through all these challenges?
Yeah. See, when I was transitioning out of my last organization and role, I think having gained the experience and body of work that I created over the last, decade plus, um, what was very clear to me was the India opportunity, because of all of my B2C and B2B experiences. What was very clear to me was that uh, there is a bit of calling that I have now with respect to nation building. And while, that could have been done across any sector, it just fit very strongly because of the founding group that we have. My co-founder Abhijit, he's been with the defense forces for in some capacity or the other in private industry for the last almost 2 decades. And so our early interactions with some of the end users, hearing their problem statements, hearing just kind of like the opportunity was really what clinched it for me. And given, it's a call for national security, ensuring India's sovereignty, it just kind of amplified, that internal call saying that there's something to be said about, building for the nation, building out in something that might look fairly difficult. But I think again, that's noise over the larger charter, right? The charter is so big that the today challenges, the challenges that we face in the future, some of the challenges we faced in the past, kind of become background noise when you're just, heads down executing towards what you know will become something instrumental in or taking part in that transformative journey that the Indian defense is going through.
Super. No, your journey is, of course, very, very inspiring. Before we let you go, I have one final question for you, which is tell us of all the things that you're working on, what is that one, tech or that product that you are most excited about, the most forward-looking, and you think could actually be, very important contribution to the overall defense industry as well?
Um, like I was saying, right, the modern battlefield is evolving very quickly. We want to build solutions that address, this evolution, that address uh, problem statements that are coming from the field. And so our entire radars and electronic warfare suite that we're going after, especially on the counter unmanned system side of it, um, there are two, three big pillars that we are kind of building this out from. One of them, low size, weight, power, typically called swap optimized, right? Ensuring that these are something that are very, very modular in nature, can easily scale up or scale down. And then finally, that one point that I spoke about earlier, which is designing for manufacturability to ensure that we're able to build these systems at scale, at the best speeds possible. Of course, not consumer speed. But if typical, bring up times would be 4 or 5 years, we're typically trying to crunch that to one-fourth or one-fifth and see if we can actually address that huge gap that we are in today and solve it, meaningfully.
Super. All the best, Rohan, for your journey. I'm sure we'll soon see you as a listed company founder in the not so distant future as well. So all the best to you. It's been a pleasure having you on our show, and wish you all the best.
Thanks a lot, Sarvesh, and thanks again for having me over. Pleasure speaking, and hope this inspires uh, some companies and some founders to kind of take that dive into this very, very exciting world and space that we're operating in.
Super. Thank you. Thank you so much.